At my wife's will reading, my son inherited the old bathhouse building I'd repaired clocks in for 30 years and told me to take my tools and go. What none of them knew was that my wife had spent 15 years building a case that could burn his wife's entire company to the ground, and she'd left me holding the match. I want to tell you how it started because the ending doesn't mean anything without it. 3 weeks before that morning, Lorraine had been buried on a hillside outside Hot Springs, and I had not cried where anyone could see me. That was the second time I wore the black suit. The third time was the will reading, and I walked into Harlan Pruitt's office already knowing my son had rehearsed something. Foster stood when I came in, shook my hand the way you shake a stranger's hand at a funeral, and sat back down next to Delphine. His wife did not stand. She never stood for anyone she considered beneath the conversation. Harlan cleared his throat and opened the folder. He read through the legal language the way lawyers do, flat and fast, and then he got to the part that mattered. To Foster Aldous Marchetti, he read, "I leave the building at 412 Central Avenue, formerly known as the Baxter Bathhouse, along with all fixtures and improvements therein valued at approximately $1.8 million. Foster's jaw tightened. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth, the way he did when he was trying not to smile. To Delphine Calloway Marchetti, Harlan continued, "I leave my full voting interest in the family trust overseeing Cascade Row Holdings along with the accompanying advisory seat." Delphine's chin came up half an inch. That was all the reaction she allowed herself. Before he opened the envelope, Harlan set down the folder and said something that didn't fit the rhythm of everything else in the room. "Your wife came to see me 6 times this past year," he said, looking at no one in particular. "Always alone. Always by appointment, never walk-in. The last time was 9 days before she went into the hospital for good." Foster's head turned at that. It was clear from his face that this was new information to him too. Harlan didn't explain further. He just picked the folder back up and kept reading the way a man does when he's said exactly as much as he's allowed to say and not one word more. Then he reached for a plain envelope with my name on it, and I felt the room go quiet the way rooms go quiet when everyone already knows what's coming and is waiting to see how the last man in it will take it. And to my husband, Ezekiel James Marchetti Harlan, said, "I leave a personal letter to be delivered by hand." Foster looked at the envelope for exactly 2 seconds before he slid it across the table to me. I had expected something in his face, shame, maybe. What I found instead was something colder, something already decided. "Dad," he said, his voice steady in a way that told me he'd practiced it in the mirror that morning. Mom knew who understood how to run things and who didn't. 30 years fixing other people's clocks, that's what it comes down to. Delphine did not stand up, did not raise her voice. She simply said that they would need the building cleared by the end of the month, that the workshop lease I'd held for 11 years was as of this reading void under the new ownership. She said it the way a person reads numbers off a spreadsheet, because to her that's exactly what it was. "You could take the bench," she added, as if she were doing me a favor. "The one with your name carved underneath? Foster told me you'd want that." I asked Harlan if the lease truly transferred with the building the way she'd said. He confirmed it did, that Lorraine had structured the paperwork years ago at Foster's own request, back when Foster had told her it would protect the workshop for me long term. I looked at my son. He didn't deny that. He didn't confirm it either. He just watched me work out the arithmetic on my own, the way he used to watch me true a wheel when he was young, waiting to see if I'd get it right without help. I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to true a wheel and set a hairspring before he was 10 years old, and I did not see him anymore. I saw a man wearing his face. "It's just math," Dad Foster said at the door. And I stopped for 1 full second before I walked out without answering him. In the truck engine off, I held the envelope in both hands and felt the weight of it before I opened it. And the weight was wrong. Too light. Lorraine never wrote anything short. Not a grocery list, not a birthday card. I unfolded a single sheet and read 4 sentences that thanked me for the years we'd shared and wished me peace in whatever came next, and every word of it sounded like it had been written by someone who had never met her. I sat there a long time with the engine off the paper flat on my knee, and I thought about the last thing Lorraine had said to me 4 months before she died. Standing at the workshop window longer than she needed to, looking out at nothing I could see. She used to do that more in those final months. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I was thinking of it now. I turned the envelope over. There was a fold along the seam that didn't sit flush, a faint ridge where the glue had been opened once already and pressed back down. Not torn, resealed. Someone had read this letter before I did. Foster had held it for 2 seconds in that office before he set it in front of me. I had read that as hesitation. It wasn't hesitation. It was a man checking that the wrong letter was still in the right envelope. I did not go back to the apartment I'd been renting since the funeral. I drove to the workshop instead, because I needed to stand somewhere that still made sense, and because somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded exactly like my wife's, was telling me that whatever she had actually written to me was still out there waiting for me to be ready to find it. I had no idea yet how far that would go, or what it would cost the people sitting across that table from me. I only knew one thing for certain sitting in that truck with a stranger's words in my hands. My wife had never once in 38 years written me a sentence that didn't mean exactly what it said. And these 4 did not sound like her at all. By midnight, every lock on the Marchetti house had been changed, and I was still standing in the kitchen, holding a small brass key that told me someone had already been planning for what came after Lorraine long before she was gone. I want to tell you how I got to that key because 2 hours earlier, I didn't even know I was looking for one. It started in the workshop, under the bench light, with the letter I already knew was wrong. I'd driven straight there from the truck, the fake letter flat on the passenger seat, like something I didn't want touching me. Under the strong light, I kept clamped over my repair bench, the kind that shows every flaw in a movement. I turned the paper over a second time. The resealed flap wasn't the only thing wrong with it. On the back, faint as a watermark, I could see the ghost of handwriting pressed through from a page that had once rested on top of it. Not the 4 sentences I'd read, different words, different rhythm. Whoever had typed this letter had done it on a pad of Lorraine's own stationery right below a page she'd already written on and never thought to check what showed through. I didn't have a way to read it clearly not that night. I photographed it anyway, both sides under raking light the way I'd photograph a movement before I touched a single screw. Evidence first, understanding later. That had always been Lorraine's rule for her ledgers, not mine. But I found myself following it without deciding to. I locked the workshop and drove home instead of back to the rental apartment because something in me needed to stand in the house we'd shared for 31 years, even with her gone from it. Ruth Abernathy was on her porch when I pulled in, a casserole dish wrapped in foil balanced on both hands, watching my truck the way a person watches for a light to come back on. "I thought you might not have eaten," she said, and followed me inside without waiting to be asked twice. She set the dish on the counter, and I could tell by the way she squared her shoulders that food wasn't the reason she'd come. "Lorraine asked me something back in the spring," she said, before she got too sick to manage the stairs. "She asked me to watch this house when she couldn't, and to come straight over the day you got back from that lawyer's office, whatever hour it was." "She told you there'd be a reading," I said. "She told me there'd be a hard day coming," Ruth said, "and that you'd handle it worse than you'd let anyone see, and better than you'd expect." Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and set a folded square of paper on my kitchen table. "She said to give you this the same night, not before." I unfolded it. Lorraine's handwriting. The real kind, quick and certain. The pen pressed hard in places, the way she wrote when she meant business and not sentiment. "Zeke, Ruth saw Delphine let herself into the house 3 weeks ago, late, using a key. I don't know what she was after. Change every lock tonight. Don't tell Foster. Don't make it a conversation. Just do it." I asked Ruth if she was certain it had been Delphine. "I've lived beside this house for 19 years, Ruth said. "I know that woman's walk from the shape of her shadow on the sidewalk. She came in around 10, stayed maybe 40 minutes, and left with something in a canvas bag she hadn't walked in with. I didn't think much of it that night. I've thought about nothing else since you told me about today." Before Ruth left, I asked her one more thing. "Did Lorraine say why?" Ruth shook her head, She said only that if it ever happened, I wasn't to call the police and I wasn't to call Foster. Only you. She said you'd know what to do with it once you had the rest. The rest of what I asked. Ruth said Lorraine hadn't explained that part, only that there was a rest and that it would come to me in its own time, the way Lorraine did most things that mattered. After she left, I tried Foster's cell twice from the kitchen phone, thinking I'd ask him directly whether he knew anything about a resealed envelope, about a key, about any of it. Both calls went straight to voicemail, without ringing, the kind of silence that comes from a phone deliberately switched off, rather than one simply out of reach. I didn't leave a message. There wasn't a version of what I wanted to say that would fit cleanly into 30 seconds, and I wasn't ready yet to let him hear anything in my voice that he could use. I got the locksmith kit out of the garage and started with the front door, then the back, then the side entrance off the mudroom that hardly anyone used. It was slow work, the kind I was built for, and I was grateful for it, in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone standing in that kitchen with me. My hands needed something to do that had a clear beginning and a clear end, something that would still be right in the morning. I finished a little after 11 and went to check the mailbox out of habit. The same habit that had made me lock every door in the house before I'd let myself think about anything else. Most of it was nothing. Circulars, a card from someone at the funeral home, a bill from the electric company addressed to both our names. The second name, already a small, permanent ache every time I saw it printed. At the bottom of the stack was a plain envelope with no return address and no stamp, which meant someone had walked it to the box themselves rather than mailed it. My name was on the front, but it wasn't Lorraine's handwriting, and it wasn't the fake, careful script from the letter Foster had handed me either. It was a third hand entirely, small and square, a stranger's. Inside was a single brass key short with a round head. Stamped into the metal was a number. 14. Nothing else. No note, no explanation, no return address to tell me where it had come from or who had left it. I stood under the porch light, turning it over in my palm. And for the first time since I'd walked out of Harlan Pruitt's office that morning, the thing I felt wasn't grief, and it wasn't anger. It was the particular, careful stillness that comes right before you understand you're standing at the edge of something much bigger than you'd been told, and that whoever had put this key in my hand wanted me to find it exactly tonight. On the one night I'd already changed every lock in the house, because someone else had a key too. Weeks later, I would find a scrap of paper folded into the inside pocket of an old coat, with nothing on it but a date and a license plate number. No explanation attached to either one. I didn't know that yet, sitting at my old workbench with the key from the mailbox still in my shirt pocket. What I knew that morning was smaller and stranger. 4 months before she died, Lorraine had told me I'd know when I needed something, and I hadn't asked her what. She'd come out to the workshop that afternoon, which she rarely did anymore, the stairs at home being easier than the walk down Central Avenue. She'd sat in the Windsor chair I kept in the corner for clients and watched me true a balance wheel for a longer stretch than she usually had patience for. Silence. "Zeke," she'd said finally. "There's a box in Otis Kavanaugh's office. Not this one," she said, tapping the wheel. "I was working on a different kind. You'll know when you need it." "More mysteries, Mari," I'd said, not looking up from the bench. She'd smiled the particular smile she had when she knew something I didn't, which, over 38 years, had turned out to be most things, and hadn't explained further. I'd asked her, half joking, whether this was something I needed to worry about. She'd shaken her head, still smiling, but something had shifted behind her eyes for just a moment before she covered it. "Not worry," she'd said. "Just patience. And Zeke, don't mention Otis to Foster. Not yet. Not until you've talked to him yourself." I'd asked why, and she'd only said that some things needed to reach me before they reached anyone else, and that she trusted me to understand the difference once I got there. I'd let it go the way I let most of her half-finished sentences go, trusting she'd finish them in her own time. I had not thought about that conversation again, until 4 months later, sitting in the same chair she'd sat in with a key in my pocket that had come from nowhere and a fake letter photographed on my phone. Otis Kavanaugh. I hadn't thought of the name in years. Not since he and Lorraine used to work together on something. At the County Historical Society. Some records project she never fully explained to me either. I kept an old address book in the shop desk, the kind with a rubber band around it, mostly obsolete now, except for the handful of names I'd never bothered transferring anywhere else. His number was still in there. In Lorraine's handwriting, not mine. Before I picked up the phone, I decided to clear out the reading chair properly, the way I'd been putting off since the funeral. Lorraine had left a cardigan draped over the back of it, and an old wool coat hung on the peg beside the door that she used to wear on cold mornings when she walked over to sit with me for an hour before the shop opened. I went through the pockets out of habit more than purpose, the way you check a coat before you give it away, not expecting to find anything but a receipt or a peppermint gone soft with age. In the inside breast pocket, folded into quarters so small it had almost gone unnoticed, was a single scrap of paper. I unfolded it at the bench under the same light I'd used on the fake letter the night before. There was a date written at the top, 8 months back, in Lorraine's hand. Beneath it, a license plate number. 7 characters, nothing else. No name, no note, explaining what the date meant or whose car the plate belonged to. Her handwriting on it was not her usual steady script. The letters leaned harder than normal, pressed too deep into the paper. The kind of writing that comes from a hand that isn't entirely calm while it moves. I sat with it a long moment, turning it over to see if anything was on the back. Nothing. Just the date, the plate, and the particular unsteadiness in the ink that told me whatever she'd been writing down, she'd been writing it in a hurry, or in fear, or both. I thought about the note Ruth had passed me the night before. Change every lock tonight. Don't make it a conversation. Just do it. I thought about the key with the number 14 stamped into it still sitting in my shirt pocket, and I wondered, not for the first time that week, exactly how much of my wife's last year I had walked through without noticing what was happening around me. I picked up the phone and dialed the number in her handwriting before I could talk myself into waiting. It rang twice. A man's voice answered unhurried, like someone who'd been expecting the call to come eventually, just not certain on which day. Kavanaugh. "This is Zeke Marchetti," I said. Lorraine's husband. There was a pause on the line. Not confusion, something closer to recognition, settling into place. "I know who you are, Mr. Marchetti," he said. "She talked about you plenty. She told me I'd know it was you on the phone by how quiet you'd get right before you asked the next question." I didn't say anything for a moment, and he made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "See," he said. "Exactly that." I told him about the key. I told him about the license plate, though I didn't read him the number. Not yet. Some instinct keeping it back until I understood more of what I was walking into. He listened without interrupting, the way a man listens when he already knows the shape of the story, and is only waiting to hear which parts you found on your own. "It's time then," he said finally. "Come by the office this afternoon if you can. There's a good deal she wanted you to understand before you went any further with any of this. I'd rather tell you in person." I asked him what any of this meant exactly. "More than a house, Mr. Marchetti," he said. "More than what your son thinks he inherited this morning. I'll explain what I can when you're sitting across from me." I hung up, put both the key and the folded scrap of paper into my jacket pocket, and sat for a moment longer at the bench, looking at nothing in particular, the way Lorraine used to look at nothing in particular from that same chair. Then I locked the shop, got in the truck, and drove toward an office I'd never once visited in 38 years of marriage, with no real idea what I was about to be told, or how much of what I thought I knew about my own life was about to turn out to be only half the story. Otis Kavanaugh's office sat above a shuttered pharmacy 2 blocks off Central Avenue, up a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of dust and pipe tobacco long since gone out of style. I'd expected something grander given the way Lorraine had spoken of him, or hadn't spoken of him, which in her case usually meant more, not less. What I found instead was a single room with a desk, 2 chairs, a wall of gray filing cabinets, and a man who rose to greet me with the unhurried economy of someone who had spent a career learning not to waste a single motion. The room had the particular order of a man who trusted his own systems more than he trusted memory. Everything squared to the edge of everything else, a single framed photograph on the wall, faded, of a much younger Otis, shaking hands with someone in a suit outside a federal courthouse. No family pictures that I could see, no clutter that hadn't earned its place. He was tall, thin, in the way of men who'd stayed active into their 60s, without ever making a show of it, with reading glasses pushed up into a head of white hair and a handshake that told me he'd measured plenty of men that way before he'd ever bothered with words. "Mr. Marchetti," he said, "sit down. I'll get right to it because I imagine you've had enough of people making you wait for things today." I sat. He didn't offer coffee, didn't make small talk about the drive over or the weather turning. He simply folded his hands on the desk and looked at me the way I imagined he'd once looked at ledgers that didn't balance. "I spent 31 years with the federal government," he said. "Criminal Investigation Division, tax fraud mostly. The kind that hides inside legitimate businesses so well that nobody notices until someone with the right eyes goes looking. I retired 11 years ago. Your wife and I met not long after, through the County Historical Society. She was cataloging old property records for the Preservation Board. I was bored and looking for something that still used the part of my brain that missed the work. I told him I hadn't known she'd done that kind of volunteering in her final years. "There's a great deal you didn't know," he said, not unkindly. That was rather the point of how she structured things. He opened a drawer and set a plain manila envelope on the desk between us, the kind with no markings, no logo, nothing to suggest what it might contain. "I want you to understand something before I hand you this, Mr. Marchetti. What your wife built over the past 15 years is not a grudge, and it is not simple spite dressed up as an inheritance. It is documentation. Careful, patient, methodical documentation, the kind that takes a certain temperament to compile, and an even rarer temperament to sit on without acting until the moment it's needed." I asked him what exactly she'd been documenting. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet I was coming to understand meant he was deciding how much of the truth I could carry out of that room in one trip. "Your wife came to me 9 years ago with a concern," he said finally. "Not about your family directly, about a business, about the way certain kinds of money move through certain kinds of companies, when the people running them believe no one is paying close enough attention to notice the difference between a legitimate deduction and a manufactured one." I felt something tighten low in my chest. A feeling I recognized from 30 years of running my hand along a piece of furniture and finding the one seam that had been glued instead of joined. "She was specific about the order she wanted things to reach you in," Otis said. "That envelope will take you to a private archive facility on Malvern Avenue run by a trust administration firm she'd worked with for over a decade. There's a storage unit there under her name. The key you found last night opens it." I hadn't told him about the key. He almost smiled at whatever showed on my face. "She described you well," he said. "She said you'd hold information back out of habit, testing whether the person across from you already knew it. I imagine you did that with the license plate too." I didn't answer that either, which seemed to satisfy him more than an answer would have. "Before I let you go," he said, "I want to be plain about something because I think you deserve plain more than you deserve comfort right now. Whatever you find in that unit is going to be larger than a house, larger than a portfolio, larger than anything that got read out loud in a lawyer's office this morning. It touches people who currently believe themselves protected. It touches a company that a great many people in this town depend on for their livelihood, whether they know it or not. Your wife was not interested in burning that down carelessly. She was interested in making sure the truth existed fully assembled in case a day came when it needed to." I asked him if that day had come. "That's not my decision to make, Mr. Marchetti," he said. "It was never going to be mine." She was very clear about that too. I picked up the envelope. My name was written on the front in a hand I didn't recognize, small and precise. And when I turned it over, there was an address printed on a plain label affixed to the back flap. Malvern Avenue. A suite number. And beneath that, printed smaller, the name of the trust administration firm that managed the building's storage division. I read it twice before the second half of the name registered, the way a word sometimes doesn't mean anything until your eyes pass over it a second time, and the shape of it finally lands. Cascade Row Holdings maintained its corporate offices on the second floor of that same building. I had dropped Foster off there myself more than once years ago, before I'd learned to stop offering. I looked up at Otis. He was watching me with the particular patience of a man who already knew exactly which sentence I'd just read, the way he'd likely watched 100 other people arrive at the same realization across that same desk, over the years each of them a beat slower or faster than the last. "Yes," he said before I could ask. "That's not a coincidence, Mr. Marchetti. Nothing about any of this has been a coincidence in a very long time." The archive facility on Malvern Avenue didn't look like anything from the outside. Just a plain brick building with a keypad entrance and a small brass plaque reading Washita Trust Administration Records Division. Inside, a woman at the front desk looked up before I'd finished crossing the lobby. And something in the way she straightened told me she'd been watching the door for a while. "Mr. Marchetti," she said. "I'm Denise. We've been expecting you." I asked how long they'd been expecting me exactly, and she smiled the way people smile when they've been given very specific instructions and enjoy following them precisely. "Mrs. Marchetti set the account up 11 years ago," she said, leading me down a hallway lined with unmarked doors. The instructions were that if a Mr. Ezekiel Marchetti ever came in with the key to Unit 14, I was to take him straight back. No forms, no waiting. She glanced at me over her shoulder. She was very specific about that too, no waiting. The storage room itself was climate-controlled, cooler than the hallway rows of numbered metal lockers running floor to ceiling under soft fluorescent light. Unit 14 was at eye level near the back wall, larger than I'd expected, the size of a filing cabinet drawer laid on its side. Denise fit a master key into the left cylinder, stepped back, and gestured for me to use mine on the right. "I'll be at the front desk," she said. "Take whatever time you need." The tumblers turned smoother than I expected for something that had sat locked for years. The drawer slid out on quiet runners. Inside, arranged with the same deliberate order I'd have expected from Lorraine's kitchen drawers, were 3 things. A cream-colored envelope with my name on it, in her real handwriting this time, the true kind I'd have known blind. A slim leather folder, unmarked. And beneath both, a small spiral notebook with a rubber band around it, the cover worn soft at the corners, the way things get when they're handled often and kept close. I took the envelope first. My hands weren't entirely steady breaking the seal, and I let myself notice that without doing anything about it. Inside was a single sheet, front and back her handwriting, filling every line the way it always did when she had something that mattered to say and didn't intend to waste a single inch of paper saying it. "Zeke, if you're reading this, you found the key. And Otis told you enough to get you this far. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the rest of it while I was still able to explain it in my own voice. Some things needed to be documented instead of spoken, because documents don't waver under pressure the way people sometimes do, even people who love each other. I want to tell you plainly what's in that folder, because you deserve plainly more than you deserve suspense, even from me. 15 years ago, I began quietly acquiring shares in Cascade Row Holdings. Small purchases through a private holding structure Tom Aldridge helped me set up, nothing that would ever appear connected to our name if anyone went looking casually. I did it slowly over a decade and a half, a little more each year as the company grew and its shares became available through employees cashing out through small estate sales, through channels no one at Cascade Row ever thought to watch closely. As of this year, I held 18% of the company. Not a controlling stake, never meant to be. But 18% is more than enough to matter because of something written into the company's original founding charter, back when Delphine's father built it. A clause meant to protect minority investors from exactly the kind of quiet manipulation he apparently never expected anyone to use against him. Any shareholder holding 15% or more can compel a full independent audit of the company's books, triggered on request, binding under Arkansas corporate law. I checked that figure twice in 2 different years with 2 different attorneys because I needed to be certain it still held. It does. It still does. I set the letter down on the metal table in the middle of the room and pressed both palms flat against the cool surface for a moment. Not reading anything, just breathing the recycled air of that room and listening to the fluorescent tubes hum overhead the way they'd hummed in every basement and garage I'd ever worked in. There was a particular smell to old paper and cold metal that I'd have recognized anywhere, and for a moment it was the only thing I let myself notice, because it was easier than noticing everything else. 18%. I read the number again in the letter. then opened the slim folder beneath it and found the figure a second time. Printed on a formal shareholder statement dated the previous spring, the ink a slightly different shade of black than the version in her handwritten letter. As if she'd confirmed the number more than once across more than 1 year, and wanted me to see that she had. I thought about 38 years of Friday paychecks handed across a kitchen counter without ever once asking what she did with the household accounts, because I'd trusted her completely, the same uncomplicated way I trusted a level or a plumb line without needing to check behind it. I thought about how many of those years she must have spent building this in rooms I never saw, with lawyers I never met, protecting something so carefully that even the protecting had needed protecting. I picked the letter back up. There was one more paragraph near the bottom. The pen pressed a little harder into the paper. The way she wrote when she was choosing her words with unusual care. I know what you're feeling right now, or something close to it. And I won't pretend I don't understand why. I chose silence too, Zeke, for longer than I should have, and I don't get to explain that away just because my reasons felt sound to me at the time. But before you decide anything about what this number means or what you should do with it, read the notebook. All of it, in order. There are things in there about how this company operates that you need to understand before 18% means anything at all. Don't skip ahead. You'll want to. Don't. I set the letter down beside the folder, and for a moment I considered simply closing the drawer, walking back out past Denise's careful patience driving home, and letting Tom Aldridge or Otis Kavanaugh or anyone else more qualified than a watch repairman carry the rest of this forward without me. It would have been the easier road, and some part of me, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, wanted exactly that. Instead, I reached for the notebook, slid the rubber band off, and opened it to the first page. I called Dutch from the truck before I'd even pulled out of the parking lot on Malvern Avenue. The notebook sitting on the passenger seat, like something that might go off if I jostled it wrong. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, like a man who kept his phone in reach out of respect for whoever might be calling, rather than any particular urgency of his own. I need your eyes on something, I said. Tonight, if you've got it. Shop slow, he said. Come by whenever. Dutch Callahan had cut hair 2 doors down from my workshop for 35 years. In the same narrow storefront, with the same 2 chairs and the same barber pole he'd rewired himself sometime in the 90s, rather than pay someone to do it. He kept the shop the way I kept mine, everything in its place, for reasons that made sense only to him. Clippers arranged by size, a row of shaving mugs nobody had used in decades, but that he refused to throw out. We'd known each other longer than that. Back to a tradesmen's guild, the 2 of us had helped keep afloat in our 30s. Back when half of Central Avenue's shopkeepers still paid dues into a common fund, and Lorraine had spent 2 years keeping the guild's books straight, after the man who'd done it before her retired without warning anyone how disorganized his ledgers actually were. He locked the front door behind me and flipped the sign, which he almost never did before closing time, and led me back to the chair by the window where the light was still decent. I set the notebook on the little table between the chairs and slid the rubber band off for the second time that day. She used the same shorthand the guild books used, I said. I recognized some of it, not all of it. Dutch put on the reading glasses he kept on a cord around his neck and leaned in close, turning pages slowly, his lips moving slightly, the way they used to when he was totaling a column of figures by hand instead of trusting a calculator. Lorraine kept those guild books for 2 years, he said. I helped her set the abbreviations up myself, back before either of us had any idea we'd still be using half of them 30 years later. He worked through the first several pages without much comment, occasionally tapping a symbol and translating it under his breath. Dates and dollar amounts and short-clipped notes that read more like a ledger than a diary. Then his finger stopped on a page, maybe a third of the way through, and he went quiet in a way that wasn't like him. What I said. This entry here, he said, tapping the page. Restoration expense coded to a vendor she's marked with initials only, CRP. $62,400. Filed against a heritage tax credit application. He flipped forward several pages. Same vendor code again here, and here. Always round numbers. Always filed the same quarter the credit renewal came due. I asked him what CRP stood for. I don't know yet, he said. But I know what it looks like, and I've kept enough small business books in my life to recognize the shape of a number that got written down because a form needed filling, not because a truck full of scaffolding and lumber ever actually showed up. We kept going. Page after page, the same pattern, repeating with small variations. Expense entries tied to preservation and restoration work on the Bathhouse District properties. Credits claimed against the state's historic tax incentive program. Vendor codes that never resolved into a name I recognized. From any contractor who'd ever actually worked in this town, Lorraine had annotated several of the entries. In the margins, small factual notes in her own hand. Rather than the guild shorthand, dates cross-referenced against county filing records, a habit I recognize now as the same patient documentation Otis had described to me that afternoon. Near the back third of the notebook, Dutch's finger stopped again, longer this time. He read the entry twice before he said anything. There's a name here, he said. Not initials this time. Full name written out once, like she wanted to be sure she'd remember it exactly. Desmond Calloway. Something in the way he said it made me look up from my own side of the page. Mean something to you, I asked. Dutch was quiet a moment, his jaw working the way it did when he was chewing on a thought he wasn't ready to spit out yet. Rings a bell, he said finally. Old fella used to be around town, years back, before my time running this shop. Maybe, can't place where I know the name from. He shook his head, more to himself than to me. Nah, probably nothing. Common enough surname around here. I asked him if he was sure. Not even a little, he said, and went back to the page, though I noticed he didn't write anything else down for a good minute afterward. His pen resting against his knee while he stared at a point on the wall past my shoulder. We worked through another 20 pages before Dutch finally sat back, pulled his glasses off, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. This isn't small potatoes, Zeke, he said. Whatever this vendor code is, whoever's behind it, this has been running for years. This is real money. State money. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. This is the kind of thing people go to prison over if it's what it looks like. I was about to answer him when my phone buzzed against the table between us loud enough that we both flinched. Unknown number, no area code I recognized, no name attached. I picked it up and put it to my ear, without saying anything at first, the way you answer a call you already have a bad feeling about. There was no voice on the other end. Just breathing slow and unhurried, close to the receiver, the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as it's deliberate. Someone on the other end who wanted me to know they were there, without needing to say a word to prove it. I looked at Dutch. He'd gone very still, watching my face the way you watch a man reading bad news over your shoulder, before you've been told what it says. "Who is it?" he mouthed. I didn't answer him either. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, listening to someone breathe on the other end of a call from a number that didn't exist anywhere I could trace it. And understood without being able to explain exactly how that whoever it was already knew precisely where I was sitting. The call ended the way it had started, without a word, just a soft click somewhere on the other end and then the flat tone of a disconnected line. I set the phone down on Dutch's little table between the chairs and didn't reach for it again for a long moment. And neither of us said anything about it, because there wasn't anything useful to say yet. It was somewhere in that silence, staring at the notebook, still open to the page with Desmond Calloway's name written out in full, that I remembered the clock. I built it for Foster and Delphine's wedding 6 years back, a mantel clock in quarter-sawn white oak with a hand-cut escapement. The kind of piece that takes the better part of 2 months to get right if you're doing it properly. I remembered standing at the reception, watching Foster carry it in from the truck himself, insisting on it, telling anyone nearby that his father had made it and he wasn't about to let a caterer's staff drop it. Delphine had thanked me for it once, briefly, at the reception. And I'd watched it get set on a shelf in their old apartment, and mostly forgotten about it after that. The way you forget about most gifts once they've left your hands. Except Lorraine had brought it back to me once, maybe 4 years ago. Told me the escapement needed adjusting, that it had started losing time. I remembered being surprised because I'd fitted that mechanism myself, and it wasn't the kind of thing that drifted without a reason. I'd opened the case, found a genuine issue, a slightly warped palette fork, nothing dramatic, and fixed it in an afternoon. Lorraine had picked it up 2 days later and driven it back to Foster's herself, which, at the time, I'd thought nothing of. I called Otis before I'd finished putting the thought together in words. He answered on the first ring this time, as though he'd been waiting for exactly this call, rather than merely expecting one eventually. "Mr. Marchetti," he said, "I take it you've remembered the clock?" I asked him how he knew what I was calling about before I'd said a word. "Because there's only one thing left in the sequence she gave me that I haven't handed you yet," he said, "and it involves a clock. Come by the office, I'd rather do this part in person as well." Dutch offered to drive me, and I let him mostly because I didn't entirely trust my own hands on a wheel just then. Otis was waiting at his desk when we came in, the same unhurried posture, though something in his face had shifted slightly. Some readiness for a harder conversation than the one we'd had that afternoon. "Sit down, both of you," he said, which told me he'd been expecting Dutch too, or at least hadn't been surprised by him. "The clock you serviced 4 years ago," he said once we'd settled into the 2 chairs across from him. "Your wife arranged for a small recording device to be installed inside the case while it was in your shop. A technician she found through a contact at the Historical Society, discreet professional well outside anyone's usual circles. She needed a legitimate reason to get that clock into a repair shop without raising a single question from Foster or Delphine, and the honest truth is, the escapement really had drifted. She didn't fabricate that part. She simply used it." I asked him how long the device had been recording and what it had actually recorded. "Periodically for the better part of 2 years," he said. "It activated on sound stored locally, and your wife retrieved the files herself every few months when she visited, under the pretense of admiring your work on the mantel." He paused, and for the first time since I'd met him that day, something like genuine reluctance crossed his face. "There's a great deal of ordinary conversation on those recordings, Mr. Marchetti. Household noise, nothing of consequence, most of it." Grocery lists read aloud. "An argument about a dinner reservation that resolves itself in under a minute. But there's also a file from March of a certain year that isn't ordinary at all, and I think you need to hear it before you decide what any of this means." He opened a drawer, took out a small memory card in a clear plastic case, and set it on the desk between us, the way a man sets down something he doesn't entirely want to be responsible for anymore. "Don't listen to it alone," he said. She was specific about that, the same way she was specific about everything else. She said I'd know it was truly you asking the right questions by how quiet you got right before you asked the next one. He almost smiled at that, the way he had the first time he'd said something similar to me. "You've done that twice now, sitting in that chair. I imagine you'll do it again once you've heard what's on this card." I picked it up, turned it once between my fingers, and didn't say what I was actually thinking, which was that some part of me had spent 30 years believing the worst thing a man could hear was a machine telling him the truth about what was broken inside it, and that I was about to test whether that was still true when the machine in question had been listening to my own family instead of a mainspring. There was a pocket watch I kept in a drawer at home, one I hadn't opened in longer than I could easily count, that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with it at the same time. I found my hand had drifted to my own jacket pocket, without my telling it to, the way it sometimes still did, checking for a weight that wasn't there. Otis noticed. He didn't ask. I was grateful for that, more than I could have explained to either of them. Dutch drove us both back toward his shop, without either of us saying much. The card sitting in my jacket pocket, the way the license plate scrap had sat there days before. Another piece of my wife's 15 years that I wasn't ready to hold up to the light just yet. "We'll do it tonight," Dutch said, finally, not quite a question. "My place. Coffee's already made." Tonight I agreed, and neither of us said another word the rest of the drive, both of us already half listening in our own separate ways for a voice neither of us wanted to hear yet. Dutch's kitchen still smelled like the coffee he'd started before I arrived, and Chester, his orange tabby, was asleep in the chair by the radiator, with one paw hanging off the edge entirely unbothered by whatever the two of us were about to do at his table. Dutch set his laptop between us, plugged in the memory card, and looked at me once before he opened the folder. "Last chance to wait till morning," he said. I told him I'd waited long enough already, and he didn't argue with that. He clicked the single file dated in March, no other name attached to it, and Delphine's voice filled the kitchen the way a stranger's voice fills a room you thought was empty. It opened mid-conversation, the audio picking up on sound, the way Otis had described, catching the back half of something already in progress. Delphine's tone was flat businesslike, the register I recognized now from the phone call I hadn't yet had with her, but somehow already knew was coming. She was talking about invoices, about a renewal date, about needing the paperwork filed before the end of the quarter, or the credit would lapse and someone would start asking why. Then Foster's voice quieter, further from whatever microphone had caught them both. "Are we sure this is still fine?" That's what he said. Not "are we sure this is legal?" "Are we sure this is still fine?" the way you'd ask about a stretch of road you already suspected wasn't holding up the way it used to. Delphine's answer came fast, no hesitation in it at all. "It's been fine for 6 years, Foster. It'll stay fine as long as nobody who understands what they're looking at ever gets a reason to look." Dutch reached over and paused it there, glanced at me. "You good?" he asked. I told him to keep going. The recording picked back up a few seconds later, the conversation shifting, Delphine's voice moving closer to whatever had picked it up, close enough now that I could hear the particular clip of her words when she was irritated rather than performing calm for an audience. "We filed against the same 3 heritage credits for 6 years running," she said. 70,000 a cycle, spread across 3 properties, so nothing looks unusual on any single filing. The state doesn't have the staff to audit every small restoration claim in a town this size, and even if they did, CRP has a business license, a mailing address, and an invoice history going back longer than either of us has been running this company. It holds up because nobody's ever had a reason to push on it. Foster's voice further away, uncertain in a way that made him sound younger than I knew him to be. "And if somebody does push on it eventually, nobody's going to," Delphine said. "Your father is not going to be a problem. He's 61 years old and he thinks the biggest scandal in this town is somebody underpaying a contractor for a mantle clock. He doesn't read financial statements. He barely reads his own mail." There was something almost fond in the way she said it, the particular contempt of someone who has decided a person is beneath worrying about and finds that decision restful. "And if he ever did figure something out?" Foster asked again, pressing in a way he apparently hadn't quite managed to let go of. "He won't," Delphine said. "But if your mother ever did." She paused, and even through a recording made years earlier in a room I'd never fully pictured until that moment, I could hear something in that pause that made the back of my neck go cold. Before she finished the sentence. "If your mother ever got too curious about the foundation's numbers, I'd handle it quietly. I've handled bigger problems than one woman with a library card and too much time on her hands." Dutch's hand moved toward the trackpad and stopped there, hovering. Neither of us quite ready to hear whatever came next. Both of us needing to hear it anyway. The file cut out abruptly a few seconds later, mid-sentence the way Otis had warned it might, a gap in the recording where the device had simply stopped catching sound. Dutch rewound it twice, both of us leaning in close to the small speaker, making certain neither of us had imagined the words we'd both just heard. We hadn't. They were there, both times, exact and unchanged. "I'd handle it quietly." Dutch closed the laptop slowly the way you close a door on a room you don't want to walk back into tonight. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The kitchen held the kind of quiet that comes after something true has finally been said out loud. The refrigerator hummed its ordinary hum. Chester shifted once in his sleep, resettled, went still again. On the wall above the stove, the old clock Dutch had owned longer than I'd known him ticked forward through seconds that suddenly felt like they were counting something other than time. And neither of us reached to fill the quiet with anything because for a while, there wasn't anything worth saying that the silence wasn't already saying better. I sat with both hands flat on the table and didn't say the thing I was actually thinking, which had nothing to do with Delphine at all. It was aimed entirely at myself. A low, steady current of anger at a man who had spent 38 years trusting the shape of his own household so completely that he'd never once noticed his wife building an entire second life around a threat he should have seen coming himself. Years before she ever needed to plan a defense against it. I'd spent 4 decades taking apart other people's mechanisms, finding the one worn part hiding behind a dozen working ones. And I hadn't managed to see the same pattern sitting across a dinner table from me twice a month for 6 straight years. Art Dutch said, finally, using the old nickname he hadn't used in years. The one that had died out sometime after his own father passed. That's not a woman talking about a spreadsheet error. That's a woman talking about your wife. Like she was a liability to be managed. I know what it is, I said. She knew, he said. Lorraine knew going in that whatever she was building, it wasn't just about protecting a legacy. It was about protecting herself from her own daughter-in-law while she was still alive to need protecting. He shook his head slowly, the way he did when he was working something over that didn't have an easy shape to it. 40 years I knew that woman near enough. I never once heard her raise her voice at anybody. And the whole time she was sitting on this. I thought about the license plate in my jacket pocket, the date written above it in Lorraine's unsteady hand, and understood all at once exactly what kind of fear had put that pen to that paper. She hadn't written it down because she was curious. She'd written it down because at some point in some year I still didn't fully understand, she had believed someone might actually come for her. And she had made sure that even if they did, the truth would survive her regardless. This isn't about a house anymore, Dutch said. Whatever you were walking into this morning, it just changed. I know I said again because it was the only thing I could say that was entirely true, and because some part of me had already understood sitting there in his quiet kitchen, with Chester's tail twitching once in his sleep, that there was no road left that led back to the man I'd been 3 weeks ago, before any of this had a name. I hadn't slept, not really, and I was at the shop before 7 the next morning, mostly because there wasn't anywhere else that made sense to be. I'd unlocked the door, put the coffee on, and was still standing at the workbench, staring at nothing in particular, when I heard someone try the handle from outside, find it locked, and knock twice, soft and uncertain. Silas was standing on the sidewalk in his work jacket, the same one he'd worn for longer than I could remember, and his hand was still resting on the door handle, like he hadn't quite decided whether he was allowed to be there. My younger brother had never once in his life knocked on a door he had a key to, and something about that alone told me, before he said a word, that this wasn't a social call. Behind him, the street was still mostly empty. A delivery truck idling 2 doors down outside the diner, its driver leaning against the tailgate with a coffee, unhurried in a way that made the rest of the morning feel unreasonably tense by comparison. I let him in. He didn't sit right away, just stood near the front counter with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, looking at the floor the way he used to look at the floor as a boy when he'd broken something and hadn't figured out yet how to say so. Art, he said finally. I need to talk to you about something. I've needed to for a while now. I told him to sit down, poured 2 cups of coffee. We both let go cold on the counter and waited. 2 weeks before the reading, he said. Foster called me. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that much from Otis and Dutch, both in the past 2 days. That the quiet you offered a person often got you further than any question you could have asked instead. He said there was going to be some complications with the estate, Silas went on. Said you might get emotional about things, might try to make trouble at the reading, and that it would help if family was there who could vouch for how the whole process had gone. Vouch for what, exactly? I asked him at the time, and he said it wasn't anything complicated, just a signature. A statement supporting how things were being distributed in case anybody ever asked questions about it later. Did he tell you what you were actually signing? I asked, setting my own cup down without having touched it either. Silas shook his head slowly, still not looking up. Not really. Some kind of witness affidavit. His lawyer had it ready, already printed, waiting on a clipboard. I signed it in the parking lot of the reading before we even went inside, standing between 2 cars, with Foster's assistant holding an umbrella over the paperwork because it had started to drizzle. He rubbed both hands over his face. He said if I did it, he'd clear the debt, $35,000, paid straight to the casino's collections people, not even routed through me. Gone. I got a text from the collections agency 2 days later, confirming the balance was zero. That was the first time it felt real, seeing that number disappear. I asked him how long he'd owed that much, though some part of me already suspected the answer would be longer than he was about to admit. Going on 2 years, he said. I never told you because I didn't want you looking at me the way you're looking at me right now. I wasn't looking at him any particular way, as far as I could tell. But I let that pass because it wasn't really about how I was looking at him. It was about how he'd expected to be looked at, which had clearly been sitting on him a great deal longer than 2 weeks. I need you to understand something, Silas said, his voice picking up speed the way it did when he was trying to get through something before he lost the nerve. I didn't know about any of the rest of it. Not the trust, not the bank, not whatever Foster and Delphine have actually been doing with that company. I thought it was just a family disagreement over a will, the kind that happens in every family eventually, and I thought you'd come out fine regardless because you always do. And I needed the debt gone. And I told myself that made it not really hurting anybody. He stopped there, mid-sentence, the way a man stops when he finally looks up and sees something in the other person's face he wasn't prepared for. I don't know what he saw in mine. I wasn't angry, not the way I'd expected to be if this conversation had happened a week earlier, before a recording of Delphine's voice had rearranged everything I thought I understood about what mattered and what didn't. Silas, I said. When was the last time you asked me for anything, directly, before this? He opened his mouth and nothing came out of it. He sat with the question for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the counter without drinking from it. And I watched him try to locate an answer that didn't exist. Because as far as I could recall, there wasn't one. 20 years and my brother had never once come to me and simply asked, I don't know. He said finally, quietly. I don't think I ever have. I nodded, mostly to myself. I wasn't angry at him, not really, not the way the moment probably called for. What I felt was closer to something tired and old, a familiar shape I recognized from 38 years of watching people I loved choose the harder, quieter road around a problem instead of the straight one through it. For half a second, I considered telling him what I'd learned the night before about Delphine's voice on a recording about a fake vendor and a scheme running 6 years deep, and decided against it just as quickly. Silas had enough weighing on him already, and whatever came next wasn't going to be made easier by handing him one more thing he couldn't undo. I'm not angry, I told him. But go home, Silas. He looked like he wanted to say something else, some further explanation that might close the distance between us, and then seemed to think better of it. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and paused at the door with his hand on the frame. The same door I'd rehung myself years ago after the old one warped in a wet spring. I'm sorry, Art, he said. I know I told him, and I did know it, and knowing it didn't change what I needed to do next, which had nothing to do with my brother's debt and everything to do with a company I now understood far better than I had 24 hours earlier. Micah called a little after 11 that night. His voice pitched low the way people's voices go when they're trying not to be heard by whoever's on the other side of a window. I need you to come down here, Mr. Marchetti, he said, or at least pick up when I call. There's a car. I asked him what kind of car, already reaching for my jacket. Dark sedan, he said. No front plate that I can see. It was out there last night, too. Same spot, same time, gone by morning both times. I didn't think much of it the first night. Tonight, it's been sitting there almost 40 minutes without anybody getting out. I asked if he'd called the police already. Non-emergency line, he said. About 20 minutes ago. They said they'd send someone by when a car freed up, and nothing urgent's happened yet, so it might be a while. He paused. I didn't want to wait around not telling you, though. Figured you'd rather know now than find out in the morning. Micah Odom had been coming to the shop 3 mornings a week for the better part of 8 months, learning the trade the slow way, the only way I'd ever known how to teach it. And in that time, I'd come to trust his judgment. More than I trusted most grown men who'd been in the business twice as long. If Micah thought something was worth a call at 11 at night, it generally was. I told him not to go outside, not to knock on the glass, not to do anything except keep the shop locked and wait for me. 15 minutes later, I was pulling up 2 blocks over, the way we'd agreed on the phone, close enough to walk the rest, but far enough that headlights in my mirror wouldn't announce anything to whoever was sitting in that sedan. Micah met me at the side door, and the first thing he did was hold up his phone already cued to a video. "I filmed it from the back room window," he said. "Cracked the blinds just enough. You can't see faces. But you can see two people in the front, and you can see how they're sitting." I watched it standing in the dark of the back room, the small screen throwing pale light across both our faces. 30 seconds of a car parked at the curb across the street, engine off, no interior lights. Two shapes visible through the windshield in the wash of a street lamp half a block down. Neither of them moved much. That was the part that unsettled me more than anything else on the screen. People waiting for someone, usually fidget, check their phones, glance at the clock. These two sat like they had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry. "Did you get the plate?" I asked. "Not the front," he said. "There isn't one. But when it pulled out the first night, I caught the rear plate under the street light before it turned on to grand." He scrolled to a still frame, zoomed as far as the image would allow without dissolving into meaningless pixels, and held it out to me. I didn't need to reach for the scrap of paper in my jacket pocket to know what I was looking at, but I did anyway. Unfolding it with hands that weren't entirely steady under the dim light of the back room. 7 characters, written 8 months ago, in my dead wife's unsteady hand. No explanation attached to either the date above it or the string of letters and numbers themselves. I held the paper up next to Micah's phone screen and looked between the two for longer than I needed to because some part of me wanted the comparison to come out different than it did. They matched. Every character in the same order, the same plate Lorraine had written down. 8 months before she died, now sitting parked across the street from the shop at 11 o'clock at night, with 2 people inside who weren't in any hurry to be anywhere else. "Mr. Marchetti," Micah said quietly, watching my face. "You know something about this car." I told him I did, though I didn't yet know how to explain what exactly or why my wife had been writing down license plate numbers in the last year of her life without ever once mentioning it to me. I asked him to walk me through the footage from both nights again, slower this time, and he did, narrating what little there was to narrate. The car arrived first night around 10:40, left just past midnight. Same window the second night, give or take a few minutes. No one approached the shop either time. No one got out of the vehicle at all, as far as he'd seen. "They're not here to break in," I said half to myself. "They're here to watch." "There's something else," Micah said, pulling the blinds a half-inch further apart so I could look for myself. He pointed across the street, tracing a line with his finger from the sedan's position to the shop's second window, the one that looked into the small office where I'd started keeping the folder from Otis. The notebook, everything that had accumulated over the past week. "It's not parked to watch the front door," he said. "Look at the angle. It's parked to see straight into that window. Whoever's in there isn't watching for you to come and go. They're watching to see if anyone goes near what's in that room." I looked out through the gap in the blinds myself, following the line he'd traced, and understood immediately that he was right. The car sat at precisely the angle that would give a clear, unobstructed view into the office, and nowhere else. I stood there a long moment, watching the dark shapes of 2 people who hadn't moved in the better part of an hour, and something in the posture of the one nearest the passenger window snagged at a memory I couldn't immediately place. A particular way of holding still, shoulders slightly forward, head tilted at an angle. I felt certain I'd seen somewhere before, recently, in a context that had nothing to do with dark cars parked on quiet streets at midnight. I couldn't place it yet, but it nagged at me the whole time we stood there watching, the unsettling certainty that whoever was sitting in that car wasn't a stranger to me at all, and that some part of my mind already knew exactly who it was, even if the rest of me hadn't caught up yet. A patrol car turned onto the street a few minutes later, slow and unhurried, and the sedan's headlights came on before the cruiser had gone half a block. Pulling away, smooth and unremarkable, the way a car pulls away when its occupants have decided the evening's business is finished, rather than interrupted. By the time the officer parked and walked over to knock on our door, there was nothing left on the street to show him except an empty curb and 2 men standing in a dark back room who couldn't fully explain even to themselves why the shape of a stranger in a parked car had left them both so unwilling to look away from the window. The call came in a little after 9 the next morning, while I was still at the kitchen table with coffee I hadn't managed to drink much of. Cascade Row Holdings. The screen read a number I hadn't saved, but recognized instantly from the shareholder documents Aldridge had walked me through the day before. I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly to make sure my voice would come out level when I did, and thought in the half-second before I picked up about something Otis had told me the day before. When she calls, and she will let her talk first. People show you more of themselves in the first 30 seconds of a call they didn't expect to have to make than they do in the rest of the conversation combined, Zeke Delphine said before I'd even finished saying hello. I'm glad you picked up. I've been hoping we could talk, just the two of us, like reasonable adults, before this gets any more complicated than it needs to be. Her voice was warm in a practiced way, each word landing with the particular care of someone who had rehearsed the shape of a sentence before she ever dialed the number. And I understood immediately that this was not the voice from the recording. That voice had been flat and certain and entirely unconcerned with how it sounded to anyone else. This one had been built for an audience, smoothed and softened, the register of a woman who wanted whatever came next to land as reasonable, regardless of what it actually was. I'm listening, I said, and kept my own voice as plain as I could manage. I know Lorraine meant well, Delphine said. Whatever she was trying to set up before she passed, I understand where that instinct came from. Truly, I do. She'd been sick a long time, Zeke, and sick people sometimes latch onto things, projects, causes, ways of feeling like they still have control over something. I'm not judging her for that. But you have to see how this looks from the outside. A woman in her final year managing complicated financial arrangements that nobody in the family had any visibility into. Our attorney has some real questions about her state of mind during that period, and about whether certain decisions were entirely her own. I let that sit for a moment, before I answered the way Otis had let his own silences sit the first time I'd met him. The kind of quiet that says more than a quick response ever could. I thought about 9 cognitive assessments sitting in a folder on Aldrich's desk about a woman who had read the Wall Street Journal every morning for 15 years and remembered every figure in it. And I let Delphine's version of my wife sit there in the quiet a moment longer before I answered it. Outside the kitchen window, the sprinkler 2 houses down had come on. The same one that ran every morning at 9, regardless of the season. And I found myself grateful for the ordinariness of that small, mechanical sound, while everything else in the conversation tilted sideways. How's Renfield doing these days, I asked. Or is it Cascade Row you're worried about this morning? I noticed there's an audit provision in the original charter. 15% triggers it. I understand somebody's holding 18. The line went quiet in a way that wasn't the quiet of someone thinking. It was the quiet of someone whose footing had shifted without warning, someone who needed a moment to find solid ground again before speaking. I don't know what you think you know, she said finally, her voice half a register lower than it had been 30 seconds earlier. The warmth gone out of it entirely. I know what Lorraine documented, I said. Which is most of it from what I understand. Probably all of it by the time her lawyer finishes going through everything. This trust will not hold, Delphine said. And now there was an edge under the words that hadn't been there before. Something sharper, trying to push its way back up through the careful composure she'd walked into the call with. I want you to understand that clearly, Zeke. Mental capacity, undue influence, these are legitimate legal grounds, and Ryan's firm doesn't take cases they can't win. Lorraine had 9 cognitive assessments on file, I said, conducted by a licensed physician at every trust review, going back over a decade. Every single one returning full legal and mental capacity. I wasn't present for a single one of those meetings. There's no undue influence claim to make when the other party never knew the asset existed in the first place. There's still the matter of the audit provision, she said, changing direction fast, the way a person changes direction when the ground they were standing on has already given way beneath the first argument. That charter clause hasn't been tested in court in 30 years. There are procedural questions about whether it even still applies to a company that's been restructured as many times as this one has. Questions about jurisdiction, about which entity the original language actually binds. Tom Aldridge seems to think it applies just fine, I said. He's been reviewing it for the better part of a year, apparently, at Lorraine's request. I imagine he wouldn't have let her spend 15 years building towards something that wouldn't hold up on the one day it actually mattered. Another silence, shorter this time, but heavier. The kind that comes right before someone decides whether to keep pretending or start telling the truth. Our attorneys will find the same documentation she started, but her voice had already lost the thread of its own argument. Words trailing without quite landing anywhere. "I'm sure they will," I said. "Tom Aldridge has been maintaining it for 11 years. He's very thorough." There was a pause then, longer than the others, 4 full seconds by my own count. The kind of silence where I could hear her breathing change on the other end of the line. Could hear something building behind it that hadn't fully decided yet whether it wanted to come out as anger or as something closer to fear. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and waited, the way I'd learned to wait over the past week, understanding without being able to say exactly how that whatever came out of that silence was going to matter more than anything either of us had said so far. "You don't understand what you're holding, Zeke," she said finally, her voice dropping into something quieter and stranger than anything I'd heard from her yet, almost as though she were talking to herself as much as to me. "This didn't start with me. None of it did." The silence stretched past 4 seconds into something closer to 6, and when Delphine spoke again, her voice had dropped into a register I hadn't heard from her before. Quieter than the warmth at the start of the call, and quieter than the sharpness that had followed it. Something closer to a person thinking out loud than a person performing for an audience. "You think you're the first person in this family who ever had to deal with a man who couldn't leave well enough alone," she said. "My father spent 30 years handling people exactly like your Mr. Pruitt. Men who found one loose thread and thought pulling on it made them righteous, never once stopping to think about who else might get unraveled along with it." I stood very still in my kitchen, my hand tight enough around the phone that I felt it in my knuckles. "I never told you that name," I said. There was a pause on her end. The particular pause of someone realizing half a second too late exactly what they'd just handed away. Wendell Pruitt had trained me at his bench on Malvern Avenue for 6 years, starting when I was 19 years old, teaching me to true a wheel and set a hairspring with a patience I hadn't understood the value of until decades after he was gone. I had never once mentioned his name to Foster, never to Delphine, never as far as I could recall to anyone in that family at all. In 6 years of holidays and dinners, and the particular small talk that fills the space between people who've never quite chosen each other, he'd lost everything. I said slowly, because I found a discrepancy in his invoices, a small one, insurance overcharges on repair claims, that I reported, because I was 23 years old and believed, with the particular certainty of the young, that the truth was always the correct thing to hand someone. It should have cost him a fine, maybe a suspended license for a year. Instead, it cost him the shop, his reputation. Everyone in this town who'd trusted him for 30 years turning their backs inside a month. He died in a rented room above a laundromat, and for the better part of a decade afterward, people in Hot Springs called me the boy who ruined Wendell Pruitt over a few $100s that should have been a private correction between 2 grown men. Delphine didn't say anything for a moment, and in that silence I understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than building slowly the way most understanding does, that the version of that story I'd carried for 40 years had never been the whole of it. "My father owned the building Wendell Pruitt's shop sat in," Delphine said finally. Her voice flat now, the performance entirely gone out of it. "He'd been trying to buy the whole block for 2 years before your report ever landed on a regulator's desk. Pruitt wouldn't sell. Kept telling my father the shop was the only thing that had ever made sense to him, and he wasn't leaving it feet first for a parking structure. My father found your complaint and made certain it went further than a fine. Made certain it went everywhere. He didn't create what you reported, Zeke. He just made sure nobody in this town was capable of forgiving it once it was out there." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I'd turn over a movement I didn't yet trust myself to reassemble correctly. "Why would you even know that I asked? That's 35 years ago. You weren't born yet." "My father told me," she said. "Not as a confession, as a lesson. He used to tell it at dinner sometimes when I was young, like it was a story about patience and leverage, rather than a story about a man who lost everything he'd built. He'd say, Find the thread that's already there and let other people believe they pulled it themselves. I didn't understand what he meant until I was old enough to run a business of my own. By then it felt less like a warning and more like an inheritance. That doesn't make it yours to carry. The same way I said, and even as I said it, I wasn't entirely certain whether I meant it as forgiveness or as an accusation. I know she said quieter than before. I've known that for a while now. I just didn't know what else to do with what he left me except keep building on top of it. You're telling me Desmond Calloway destroyed Wendell Pruitt over a parking lot, I said? Over land, she said. It's always land in the end, or the money land turns into. You should know that by now, given everything you've apparently already read. I thought about the man parked outside my shop 2 nights running, watching a window that held nothing more dangerous than a folder and a notebook. And I asked her, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect, whether the person sitting in that car had worked for her father too. The silence that followed was its own answer long enough that I nearly asked again before she spoke. He's been with the family a long time, she said carefully. The words chosen now, deliberate. A woman realizing exactly how much ground she'd already given away and trying too late to stop the bleeding. That's all I'm going to say about that. Does Foster know any of this? I asked. About Pruitt, about the car? No, she said. And for the first time in the entire call, something in her voice sounded almost young. He's never known the half of what my father built or what I've kept running since. I used to think that was protecting him. Lately, I'm less sure what I've actually been protecting. I didn't say anything for a moment. I sat in my kitchen with the truth of 40 years rearranging itself in real-time, understanding, for the first time in my life, that the story I'd told myself about my own worst mistake had never once been mine to fully own. That a man with money and a grudge and a piece of land he wanted had reached into my life before I'd even turned 30 and left me carrying a shame that had never entirely belonged to me in the first place. I think I understand this a great deal better than you think I do, I said, and I hung up before she could answer. Because there wasn't anything left in that conversation I needed to hear from her directly. I set the phone down on the kitchen table face down and didn't pick it back up. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at nothing in particular, the way dogs do on quiet mornings when nothing is actually wrong. I sat there a long while, and what came to me unbidden wasn't Delphine's voice or my father-in-law's name spoken like a stranger's, but the smell of linseed oil in Wendell Pruitt's shop on a winter morning. The particular way he'd held a mainspring up to the light before he'd let a 19-year-old boy touch it for the first time and told him without any drama in his voice at all that a watch never lied about what was broken inside it, even when everyone standing around it did. I couldn't sleep, which by that point in the week had stopped being much of a surprise. And a little after midnight, I gave up trying and drove down to the shop instead, telling myself I only wanted to check that everything was locked the way I'd left it. That was true as far as it went. It also wasn't the whole reason, and I knew it wasn't even as I was pulling my jacket on in the dark hallway of a house that had felt too large and too quiet since October. Some part of me had been listening for that sedan all evening without admitting it to myself, half hoping it would come back, so I'd have somewhere to put the anger that had been sitting in my chest since Delphine's call that morning. There was a car parked across the street when I turned onto Central Avenue. Not the dark sedan from before. A smaller car, newer. The kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who cared what the interior smelled like. The engine turned over as I approached. Headlights they were. I walked out into the middle of the street anyway. My hand raised, not thinking clearly about whether that was a wise thing to do at midnight with a stranger behind a wheel, who'd clearly been waiting for something. The car idled there a moment longer, brake lights holding steady, and then the engine cut off again. I crossed the rest of the distance and knocked twice on the driver's side glass, and the window came down slow, and it was Foster looking back at me. His face lit pale by the dashboard, looking like a man who had been caught at something he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. "Dad," he said. I stood there on the wet asphalt for a moment, working out what I was looking at. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his own hands on the wheel, and when he finally spoke, His voice had none of the practiced steadiness I remembered from the will reading. None of the rehearsed line about math and sawdust that had sent me out of that office 3 weeks ago. "I don't know," he said. "I've been sitting here for almost an hour. I kept telling myself I'd go knock on the door, and then I kept not doing it." I asked him if he'd been the one in the sedan the 2 nights before. "No," he said, quick enough that I believed him. "I didn't know about that until this morning. I overheard part of a call. Delphine on the back deck thought I was still in the shower. I heard her say your name. I heard her say Pruitt's name, and I didn't know who that was until I looked it up an hour ago and found an obituary from 30 years back." He rubbed both hands over his face, the way Silas had rubbed his 3 days earlier, in almost the same posture of a man discovering he'd been standing on ground that had never been solid. "She's been running something, hasn't she?" he said. "Not just the trust dispute, something older, something that started before either of us." I didn't answer him directly, mostly because I wasn't yet certain how much was mine to tell and how much belonged to Delphine to explain or fail to explain on her own. I asked him instead what he actually knew and how much of it he'd known before this morning. Nothing, he said, and there was something raw in the word. Unpracticed in a way I hadn't heard from my son in longer than I could easily place. I knew the company was tight on cash some quarters. I knew she handled the historic tax stuff because it was complicated, and I hated the paperwork. I never once asked to see the underlying numbers, because asking felt like accusing her of something, and I didn't want to be the kind of husband who accused his wife of things. I thought about Silas saying almost exactly that in almost exactly that tone 2 mornings before, and understood that I was looking at the same shape of harm, taking a different face. "I don't know what she's actually done," Foster said. "Not all of it. But I know it's bigger than I want it to be, and I know I can't walk into Baxter's office Wednesday and pretend I don't know that anymore." He reached across to the passenger seat, picked something up and held it out through the open window. A plastic access card, blank except for a magnetic strip and a small printed logo. Cascade Row Holdings, in simple type across the top. "I can't bring you inside, Dad," he said. "I'm not ready for that. I don't even know what I'd be walking us both into if I did. But I can give you this." I took it from him without asking what it opened, or how he'd come to have a spare, or what it would cost him if anyone at that company ever noticed it was gone. Some part of me knew I had no real proof yet, that my son could be trusted with any of this, that a man who'd stood in a lawyer's office 3 weeks earlier and called 40 years of my life just math, didn't automatically earn a place back inside my confidence because he'd spent an hour sitting outside a shop working up the nerve to knock. But I thought about Lorraine's letter about the wax tin and the wax tin's contents, about a woman who had spent 15 years building a case and had still, at the very end of it, chosen to leave her son a door rather than only a verdict. Some things I was learning a man simply had to decide to trust, before he'd earned reasons to, or he'd spend the rest of his life standing in the street at midnight, unable to close the last few feet of distance between himself and the people he loved. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more plainly than I'd meant almost anything I'd said in 3 weeks. He nodded once, then hesitated, one hand still on the wheel. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think she ever hated you, Dad. I think she just decided a long time ago that people like you were easier to manage than to understand. I don't think she's entirely wrong that it worked most of the time. I just don't think I can keep pretending that's the kind of marriage or the kind of company I want to keep standing inside of." I didn't have an answer for that. Not one that felt honest enough to offer him at 1 in the morning on a wet street. So I only nodded back and let the silence between us carry whatever I couldn't yet say out loud. He rolled the window most of the way back up and sat there a moment longer, before he finally pulled away from the curb, taillights shrinking down Central Avenue toward wherever a man goes at 1 in the morning, when he's no longer certain which house is actually his. Nathaniel Osei's office sat on the 3rd floor of a converted bank building 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind of space with high ceilings and old crown molding that firms rented specifically because it made clients feel like their problems were being handled by someone serious. A row of framed diplomas hung behind the desk, university seals and bar admissions arranged with the same deliberate order I recognized from Otis's office. the particular tidiness of men who trusted their credentials to speak for them before they'd said a word themselves. He'd texted me the evening before a message I hadn't expected, from a lawyer currently representing my son in a contest against my late wife's trust. Mr. Marchetti, my name is Nathaniel Osai. I represent Foster Marchetti. I'd like to meet with you directly before this goes any further. I think there are things about this situation you should understand. I'd written back a single line. Tomorrow morning, I'll come to you. He was younger than I'd expected. Early 30s, a navy suit that fit him the way suits fit men who'd learned early that appearances mattered in rooms like this one. Wire-rimmed glasses pushed up into close-cropped hair. He stood when I came in, extended a hand, and gestured me toward a chair across from a desk stacked with folders in careful squared piles. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'll be direct with you because I think this situation calls for it more than most." I told him to go ahead. Foster told me when he first retained our firm that his mother had experienced significant cognitive decline in her final 2 years, he said. Confused easily, influenced by outside parties. He told me she wasn't in a condition to make sound estate decisions and that you'd taken advantage of that decline. That was the basis on which I agreed to represent him and file the contest. And now I said. He opened a folder on his desk and slid it toward me, though I already knew roughly what it contained. "I've read the full evidentiary package Tom Aldridge's office sent over yesterday afternoon," he said. 9 annual cognitive assessments, conducted by a licensed physician at every trust review from the year the trust was established through this past spring. He tapped the folder once. All 9 returned the same finding: full legal and mental capacity. The most recent assessment was taken 7 months before your wife's death. She requested them herself, I said. Every year. Not because a doctor recommended it, because she knew someone might eventually challenge what she'd built, and she wanted to be certain in advance that there'd be nothing left to challenge. Nathaniel nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a piece of information settles a question he'd already half suspected the answer to. That's precisely what the documentation shows, he said. Your wife anticipated a challenge and specifically prepared for it years in advance with a level of foresight I don't see often in this line of work. He looked at me steadily. Foster told me she wasn't capable of that kind of planning. These records tell an entirely different story. He picked up his phone, scrolled briefly, and set it on speaker between us. "I'd like to verify something directly if you don't mind," he said, and dialed a number I recognized before it finished ringing. Otis Kavanaugh, the voice on the other end, said. "Mr. Kavanaugh, this is Nathaniel Osai. I have Ezekiel Marchetti in my office. I want to confirm for the record whether you have any reason to doubt the authenticity or chain of custody on the documents your firm transmitted yesterday." "None whatsoever," Otis said without hesitation. "Every document in that package was compiled and stored under my direct supervision, per Mrs. Marchetti's explicit instructions over a period of 11 years. I'd stake my professional reputation on every page of it. And at my age, that's not a thing I offer lightly." Nathaniel thanked him, ended the call, and sat back in his chair, folding his hands. "I was retained under false pretenses," he said. "I want you to know I've represented Foster on other matters for about 2 years. I don't believe he's a fundamentally dishonest person. I think he's been in a marriage that made certain things easier not to examine closely, and those small choices compounded over time into something considerably larger than any single one of them. I thought about the wax tin, about the man parked outside my shop, about Wendell Pruitt's name landing in a phone call 35 years after his death. And I said nothing because Nathaniel wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know," he said, choosing his next words with the deliberate care of a man who understood exactly how much weight they'd carry. "Delphine's attorney reached out to my office separately 2 days ago, not through Foster, directly. She indicated she had information she wanted to make available, and that she wanted to speak with you first before anything formal happened." He paused. "I don't know what that information is, but she didn't sound to my associate, who took the call like a woman still fighting for a position. She sounded like someone who'd already made a decision and was working out how to live with it. I'm recommending withdrawal of the contest to Foster today," he said. If he declines to withdraw it himself, I'll resign from the case rather than continue arguing a position I now know to be factually false. That's not a threat, Mr. Marchetti. It's simply where the evidence leaves me. I asked him what happened next, practically speaking. There's a formal session I'd like to request at Baxter's office, he said. Wednesday, 3 days from now. All parties present. I think it's time this gets resolved directly in a room, rather than through filings and phone calls that only let people avoid looking at each other, while they decide what they actually believe. I told him Wednesday worked. He walked me to the door himself, rather than letting an assistant do it, and paused there with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said, your wife built something unusually thorough. In this business, you don't often get to say that about anyone. I thanked him and asked before I stepped out onto the landing whether he had any sense of what Delphine might actually want to say to me given the chance. He considered that for a moment, choosing his answer as carefully as he'd chosen everything else that morning. I couldn't tell you, he said. But my associate said she asked one question before she hung up. She wanted to know if you were the kind of man who'd let someone explain themselves, or the kind who'd already decided not to listen. I said I didn't know you well enough yet to answer that. I imagine you're the only one who can. I walked back out onto the third-floor landing past the old crown molding and the tall windows, letting in flat gray morning light. Already counting the 3 days ahead of me, the way I used to count the hours left on a piece of glue drying. Knowing exactly how much time remained before something either held or it didn't. I stayed at the shop long after Micah had gone home the night before the session at Baxter's office, telling myself I had a mantelpiece to finish for a client in Little Rock, when the truth was simpler than that. I didn't want to be in the house on Willow Street, with its quiet rooms and its cracked study window, not that night. I wanted to be somewhere with tools, where a man could still tell the difference between something broken and something merely waiting to be understood. I'd stopped at home on the way in, and taken the pocket watch out of the drawer where it had sat, untouched, for the better part of 40 years. I set it on the bench now, under the same strong light I'd used on the fake letter 3 weeks earlier, and looked at it the way I hadn't let myself look at it in longer than I could easily count. It was a simple piece, nothing remarkable to anyone who didn't know its history. Plain case, worn smooth at the edges from decades in someone's pocket before it ever reached mine. The crystal had a hairline crack running from the 7 toward the center, and the hands had stopped at 11 minutes past 4, wherever that particular afternoon had found it, and stayed there ever since. Because I had never once in 40 years of repairing other people's timepieces allowed myself to fix my own. Wendell Pruitt had given it to me on my last day at his bench, 6 weeks before my report reached a state regulator's desk, and started the slow unraveling of everything he'd built. It hadn't been a gift, exactly. He'd handed it to me and said the movement needed attention when he had time, and he never found the time, because by the following spring he no longer had a bench to find it at. I'd kept it in a drawer for the 2 years afterward while the town decided, collectively and without much discussion, what kind of man had done what I'd done. I'd kept it through his funeral, which 11 people attended, in a plot the county paid for because there was no family left to claim him, and no money in his accounts to claim it with. I remembered standing at the edge of that small gathering in a borrowed coat 25 years old, not one person there able to look directly at me for longer than it took to nod, as though my presence itself was a kind of accusation nobody had the words for yet. I'd kept it every year since, through Lorraine, through Foster's birth, through 38 years of a life I'd built on the far side of that winter, because some part of me had decided a long time ago that fixing it would mean deciding I'd earned the right to stop carrying what it represented. I sat on the stool at my own bench and turned it over once in my palm. For 35 years I had told myself a simple story about what happened to Wendell Pruitt. I found something wrong, I said it out loud, and the truth once spoken did what truth apparently did to men who couldn't survive its weight. It had made me careful my whole life in a particular way. Quiet in rooms where quiet wasn't required, slow to name a problem even when I saw it clearly, because some deep, unexamined part of me had spent 4 decades believing that naming things was itself the danger. But that had never been the whole of it, and I understood that now. with a clarity that didn't feel like relief so much as it felt like grief, arriving late to a funeral it should have attended the first time. Desmond Calloway hadn't been destroyed by my report. He'd been destroyed by a man who wanted his land and had been waiting, patient as a spider, for any thread he could use to bring the whole structure down at once, all the way down past any correction that might have let Wendell keep half of what he built instead of losing all of it. My honesty hadn't been the danger. It had been a tool someone else picked up and swung far harder than it was ever built to be swung. I sat with that a long while, the shop quiet around me, except for the small mechanical chorus of a dozen other clocks ticking in their own separate rhythms on the walls and shelves, each one keeping its own private time. None of them agreeing with any of the others, by more than a few seconds, the way they never quite did, no matter how carefully I regulated them. Only the watch in my hand stayed silent, its hands fixed at 4:11, a small, dead center in the middle of all that patient ticking. I thought about how many times over the years a customer had asked why I kept a broken watch on display near the register, and how many times I'd given some version of an answer that wasn't the true one. Something about sentiment, about a piece I hadn't gotten around to yet, when the truth was closer to a vow I'd never once said out loud to another living person. Tomorrow I would walk into Baxter's office holding something with the power to take Cascade Row Holdings apart completely, publicly, permanently, and some part of me, the part that had spent 35 years afraid of exactly that kind of consequence, wanted very badly to do precisely that, to let the truth land with the full, unmerciful weight it was capable of landing with. But I understood something else now too. Sitting alone with a dead man's watch in an empty shop the night before I'd have to decide. The difference between justice and demolition had never been about how much truth you were willing to tell. It was about whether you let someone else's hand guide how hard it landed, or whether you decided yourself exactly where to set it down. I would not let this become what happened to Wendell Pruitt. Whatever I did tomorrow, it would be measured. It would be mine to place, not handed over to be swung by someone else's grudge. I didn't fix the watch that night. I set it back down on the bench, its hands still frozen at 4:11, and I didn't reach for a screwdriver, though every instinct in my hands wanted to. Some things I was learning needed to stay exactly as broken as they'd always been, at least a little while longer, so a man didn't forget what he'd nearly let happen to himself twice in one lifetime. I turned off the bench light. Behind me, the mantelpiece for Little Rock sat unfinished on the workbench, the varnish only half applied, and I left it that way. Walked to the door and turned off every other light in the shop, one at a time, until the only sound left in the dark was the small, private ticking of clocks I couldn't see keeping time, for no one, and one dead watch in my jacket pocket keeping no time at all. Exactly the way I'd chosen to leave it. Harlan Pruitt's conference room looked exactly as it had 3 weeks earlier. The same pale wood table, the same tall windows framing Central Avenue in flat November light, and yet nothing about walking into it that Wednesday morning felt anything like the first time. I'd worn the black suit for the 4th time in my life. The first had been Foster's wedding, the second Lorraine's funeral, the third the will reading. 3 weeks, and what felt like a decade ago. This 4th time, I knew exactly what I was walking into, and why. And that alone made the whole morning feel different in my chest. Steadier somehow. The way a job feels different once you understand every joint in it before you've cut the first piece. Foster was already seated when I arrived, his files stacked in neat columns in front of him, and he stood when I came in, not the brief courtesy he'd offered at the will reading, but something closer to relief, gripping my arm with both hands for a moment before we sat down together, on the same side of the table. Delphine came in 2 minutes later and took a chair separated from Foster by 2 empty seats, looking at no one as she sat, her hands folded in front of her, with a stillness I recognized now as something closer to bracing than composure. Nathaniel entered last, set his briefcase on the table, and opened it without waiting to be asked. "Before we proceed," he said, "I need to formally notify all parties that I am withdrawing the contest notice filed on behalf of Foster Marchetti, effective immediately." He placed a single sheet on the table. After a thorough review of the evidentiary record, including 9 annual cognitive assessments, physician attestations at each trust review, and 11 years of independent legal certification, I cannot, in good conscience, continue this challenge. The documentation is complete, consistent, and unimpeachable. I apologize for the time this process has taken. Harlan noted it for the record, his pen moving in small, unhurried strokes across the page in front of him. No one raised an objection. Delphine's own attorney, seated beside her, said nothing at all, and something in his silence told me he'd already had this conversation with his client before they'd walked into the room. Nathaniel opened a laptop, turned it so the small screen faced the table, and looked once at me before he continued. A silent question I answered with a single nod. "There's a recording relevant to the trust's origin," he said. "Mr. Marchetti obtained it through legitimate means, and its authenticity has been verified independently by Mr. Kavanaugh's office. I'd like it entered into the informal record of this session, with everyone's understanding that it speaks for itself better than I could summarize it." He pressed play. Delphine's voice filled the room flat and certain, the words about invoices and vendor codes and vulnerable old men who didn't read financial statements landing in that quiet space with a weight they hadn't carried in Dutch's kitchen, because now there were witnesses beyond the two of us who already knew what was coming. I watched Delphine's face while it played. She didn't look at the laptop. She looked once directly at Foster, a brief flick of her eyes that held something I couldn't fully name. Not quite apology and not quite defiance. Something suspended between the two that she pulled back from her face almost as quickly as it had appeared. Foster didn't look away from her. He simply watched, his jaw tight, until the recording finished and the room went quiet again. Nathaniel closed the laptop. "That," he said, "establishes both motive and prior knowledge regarding the matters documented in Mrs. Marchetti's files. I don't believe there's any further ground for dispute here." Delphine's attorney cleared his throat and started to speak, and Delphine put a hand briefly on his arm, a small gesture that stopped him before he'd gotten a full word out. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not right now." Harlan looked at me then, setting down his pen. "Mr. Marchetti," he said, "the floor is yours if you have anything you'd like to say before we move to the trust distribution." I'd thought about this moment more than any other over the past 3 days. More than the reveal itself, more than the recording, more than the number Aldridge had first said out loud in his office weeks earlier. I stood because it felt like the kind of thing that needed saying on my feet. "I'm not here to burn Cascade Row to the ground," I said. "I have the standing to force a full public audit immediately, and I understand what that would likely do to a company this size. To its stock, to its employees, most of whom had nothing to do with any of this, and simply came to work every morning, trusting their paychecks were what they appeared to be. I'm not interested in punishing people who didn't choose this." Foster's eyes came up to mine. Delphine's stayed on the table. "What I want," I said, "is a supervised audit conducted independently with full restitution to the Heritage Tax Program over a structured period, and permanent binding oversight on the Historic Properties Division going forward, reporting directly to the board rather than to any single officer. I want the people responsible held to account in proportion to what they actually did, not in a way that takes down 200 employees because 3 people made choices those employees never had a hand in. I want it done in a way that leaves a company standing, that can still pay the people who show up to work there every morning, without knowing any of this. And I want it done in a way that doesn't require me to become the kind of man who decides other people's ruin is an acceptable cost of being right." Harlan looked between the 2 lawyers at the table, then back at me. "And if that's refused," he said. "Then I use everything I have," I said. "And I don't stop until there's nothing left standing. But I'd rather not. I don't think my wife spent 15 years building this so that the last thing it accomplished was hurting people who never wronged her." Delphine's attorney leaned toward her, said something too low for the rest of us to catch, and she shook her head once, barely, before he sat back. Nathaniel looked over at me with something that wasn't quite surprise, more the particular respect of a man recalibrating his estimate of another man mid-conversation. "That's an unusually restrained position, Mr. Marchetti," he said, "given what you're actually holding." It's the only position that doesn't make me the same kind of man who did this to somebody else once before, I said, and didn't explain further because it wasn't a story that belonged in that room, not that morning. The room held that for a long moment, nobody quite ready to be the first to respond to it. Then Harlan reached into the folder in front of him, and I watched his hand close around a cream-colored envelope I recognized instantly, the same kind Baxter had slid across this same table 3 weeks earlier, except this one had never been opened. Mrs. Marchetti left a final letter he said to be read at this session, in the presence of all parties. She left it in my keeping specifically for this purpose. He slid it across the table toward me. "Would you like to read it yourself, Mr. Marchetti?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and reached for the seal. Harlan cleared his throat once the room had gone as quiet as it was going to get, and read it aloud because that was what she'd asked of him, and because I found holding the paper in my own hands that my voice wasn't entirely steady enough yet to trust with it myself. "If you're hearing these words in that room she'd written, it means someone tried to undo what I spent 11 years carefully building, and that Tom's preparation held exactly the way I believed it would. I want to be clear about something before anything else. This trust was never a punishment. It was never a rebuke to anyone sitting at that table. It is a recognition of a simple truth I spent 38 years watching prove itself over and over in 100 small mornings you never thought anyone was counting. The money in that account came from your hands, Zeke. From 40 years of showing up in other people's homes and workshops, fixing what was broken, building what was needed, asking for nothing beyond a fair wage and the dignity of good work done well. You gave me your paycheck every Friday without once asking what I did with it. That trust is what I did with it. That's all it ever was." Harlan's voice carried steadily through the room, and I watched Foster's hand come up to press against his mouth, his shoulders pulling inward, the way mine must have looked 3 weeks earlier, standing in a parking garage with a fake letter on my knee. To Delphine, the letter continued. "I don't write this with anger, though I imagine you expect that I might. I write it with something closer to sorrow, because I believe you are more than the choices you've made, even the ones that hurt people I love. The man you called ordinary at that table has built things in this city that will outlast every deal you've ever closed. And I think somewhere underneath everything, your father taught you to value. You already know the difference between price and value. I think that's precisely why a letter like this one frightens you more than any audit could." Across the table, Delphine looked down at her hands and did not look up again for a long while. When she finally did, her eyes were red in a way I hadn't seen from her before. Not the performed vulnerability of the phone call 3 days earlier, something closer to a woman recognizing she'd been fully seen by someone who was no longer alive to see her respond to it. She didn't say anything. She simply nodded once to no one in particular and looked back down at the table. "To Foster, my son," she'd written, "do you remember the little clock we kept above the mantel in the nursery? The one you helped your father build when you were 7 years old? You picked out the walnut yourself, insisted on the piece with the swirl in the grain, the one the lumberyard wanted to sell at half price because they called it a flaw. Your father told you that swirl was where the tree had worked hardest, bending around something and refusing to break, and you believed him completely, the way children believe the people who love them. I still have that clock. I never once let it stop running, not in 30 years. I need you to know that. I need you to know I never stopped seeing the boy who chose the flawed piece on purpose, because his father told him it was the strongest part of the tree. That boy is still in there, Foster. Find him." Foster's breath caught audibly. He pressed the back of his hand hard against his eyes and held it there, and beside him I watched Nathaniel look down at his own folded hands, giving him whatever privacy a crowded room could still offer. "And to you, Art," she'd written, and I had to stop there. One full breath before I could keep going, because she had never once in 38 years written my full given name unless she meant something to land with its full weight. "I know about the watch. I found it years ago in the bottom drawer of your workshop desk while I was looking for a screwdriver. And I never said a word about it because I understood, without needing you to explain, that some things have to stay broken until a person is finally ready to let them be whole again. I don't know if you're ready yet, I hope by the time these words reach you that you're closer than you were. I spent a long time believing silence was the safest thing I could give the people I loved. Because I watched what happened to you, the one time you told the truth loudly, and let someone else decide how hard it would land. I built all of this quietly because I thought quiet was the only kind of love strong enough to protect you from that happening twice. I was wrong about one part of it, though. It took me most of my life to see it clearly. The truth was never the danger, Art. It never was. What matters is who's holding it when it finally gets told, and how carefully they choose to set it down. I think you already know that now, better than I ever managed to teach you. If there's a way, when this is finished, to say Wendell Pruitt's name out loud again in this town, not as an apology, but as a correction, I hope you'll find it. I think it might be the last piece either of us has left to finish. By the time you're reading this out loud, and I knew you would because you've never once in your life kept an important thing entirely to yourself, I hope you understand why I did it all the way I did. The life I planned is yours now. Take every day of it. You earned it 40 years before I ever put a number on it. All my love always and without reservation. Lorraine. I folded the letter and pressed it flat against my chest with one hand the way I'd pressed the fake one against it 3 weeks earlier in a parking garage, except nothing about this felt the same at all. Harlan removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly and set them back on his nose without saying anything for a moment. "The matter is resolved," he said finally. "The trust proceeds to distribution under the terms Mr. Marchetti has proposed." Foster stood before the session had even fully ended. He crossed the short distance around the table and stood in front of me, opened his mouth, closed it again, and then put his arms around me, the way he hadn't since he was a teenager, fully and without reservation. And I held my son in that conference room, and felt something that had been wound tight in my chest for 23 days finally begin slowly to let go. The afternoon light came through the tall windows behind us in long, pale bars falling across the table, across the empty cream envelope, across Delphine's still-folded hands, and for a moment nobody in that room moved or spoke at all. The whole of it holding still together in the particular quiet that comes only after something true has finally fully been said out loud. Somewhere below us on Central Avenue, a delivery truck downshifted at the corner, ordinary and indifferent to everything that had just happened 4 stories above it. And I found I was grateful for that, too. For a world that kept moving forward regardless, the same way it always had. The same way it would tomorrow morning, whether or not anyone in that room had slept. 3 weeks after the session at Baxter's office, I stood at the main bench on an ordinary Tuesday morning with Micah beside me, watching him fit a mainspring into a mantel clock with the particular careful patience I'd spent 8 months teaching him, and thought, not for the first time that month, that the shop had never once needed me quite as much as I'd needed it. "I'm going to step back for a while," I told him, setting down the loop I'd been using to check his work. Not walking away, just stepping back. There are things I need to do that don't happen at this bench, and I don't know exactly how long any of it will take. Micah set his own tools down and looked at me steadily, the way he'd looked at everything since the night of the sedan, weighing a thing fully before he let himself respond to it. "I'd like you to run the place while I'm doing that," I said. "Full operational authority. I keep the deed, you keep the work and the decisions that come with the work. We'll sort out the particulars as we go, but I want you to hear the offer plainly before we start negotiating details." He didn't answer right away, which was exactly the kind of response that had made me trust him in the first place. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than I had any right to expect from a 19-year-old being handed a business he'd apprenticed at for less than a year. "You called the police that night," I said, before he could talk himself out of believing he'd earned it. "You documented everything. You got the report number without being asked to. You kept showing up every single morning for 8 months through all of this without once complaining that none of it was actually your fight. That qualifies you, Micah. More than qualifies you." He looked down at the bench, then back up at me, his jaw working the way it did when he was deciding whether to say something he wasn't fully sure he'd earned the right to say yet. "Thank you, Mr. Marchetti," he said finally. "I won't let you down." I know I told him, and I did know it with a certainty that had very little to do with hope, and a great deal to do with 8 months of watching him prove it, one ordinary morning at a time. Foster came by that Thursday afternoon later than the shop usually stayed open, and knocked at the door the way people knock when they're not entirely certain of their welcome, even after everything. I told him to come in, and he did, walking the length of the space, slowly looking at everything with the particular attention of a man seeing a familiar place clearly for the first time in years. He stopped in front of the shelving along the east wall, the white oak I'd fitted into the studs myself back in the year I first took the lease, joined with wooden pegs instead of screws, and ran his hand along one shelf the way a person touches something they're trying to understand, rather than simply admire. "How old is this?" he asked. "Built it the year I signed the lease," I said. "Took about a week. Pegs instead of screws because wood wants to move with the seasons, and screws fight that instead of letting it happen. You have to build a thing that can shift a little without coming apart." He nodded slowly, his hand still resting on the shelf, and I couldn't tell whether he was listening to me talk about joinery or something else entirely, though I suspected by then it didn't much matter which. He came and sat down across from me in the Windsor chair, and I settled onto the stool at my own bench, the way I had with Delphine weeks earlier, though nothing else about the two conversations resembled each other in the slightest. "I'm starting over," he told me. "Not at the top. Nathaniel helped me negotiate a position in the Historic Properties Division itself, the one that's actually under the new oversight now. Entry level, more or less. I answered to a compliance officer 20 years younger than I am, who used to work for the state auditor's office." I asked him how that felt, honestly. He considered it a moment before he answered. "Like the first year I ever worked a real job," he said. "Like I actually have to learn what I'm doing instead of just being told I already know it." He looked around the shop again at the shelves, at the tools hung in their proper places, at the particular order I'd spent 40 years building, without ever once thinking of it as anything worth explaining to anyone. "I think I understand now why you never wanted to leave a place like this," he said. "There's nothing in here you can fake your way through." I asked him carefully how Delphine was doing and whether they'd spoken since the session. "We're getting a divorce," he said, without much drama in it, the way a man states a fact he's had time to settle into. "Amicably, as much as that word means anything. She's cooperating fully with the audit. Nathaniel says that's helped more than anyone at the company expected it to. I think in her own way she's relieved someone finally made the decision for her." We sat a while without talking much, the way I'd once sat with Dutch on countless slow afternoons over 35 years. Two people who'd found their way back to the same room without needing every silence between them filled. After Foster left, I locked up, and instead of driving straight home, I sat back down at the bench and took the pocket watch out of my jacket pocket where it had stayed every day since the night before the session. I had fixed the movement finally 2 weeks after Baxter's office, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, with no client waiting and no reason left to keep putting it off. The escapement had needed almost nothing, as it turned out, a single worn pivot, the kind of repair I could have made blind after 40 years at this bench. It ran now, steady and even, keeping time, the way it should have kept time for 35 years if I'd ever let myself finish the job. But I had not touched the face. The crystal still carried its hairline crack from the 7 toward the center, and I had left it there on purpose. The one piece of the repair I would not complete. Because some part of what that watch had cost me, and cost Wendell Pruitt before me, deserved to stay visible, rather than polished away into something that looked from the outside like it had never been broken at all. I turned it over once in my palm, listening to it tick steady and quiet, keeping honest time again after 35 years of standing still. Not everything I had come to understand needed to be made whole to be trusted. Some things simply needed to keep working, cracked case and all, carrying their history forward in plain sight instead of hiding it under a fresh coat of varnish. I thought, sitting there in the dim shop with the watch ticking steadily against my palm, about a woman who had spent 15 years building something out of nothing more than $15 a week and an unshakable belief that the world would always need people who built things meant to last. I thought about a boy who'd picked out a flawed piece of walnut because his father told him the flaw was where the tree had worked hardest. I thought about a man above a laundromat, who never got the chance to see any of what came after him, and about the particular, unglamorous kind of justice that doesn't announce itself with headlines, that simply keeps a small shop's lights on for one more generation, and lets a name be spoken honestly again after 35 years of silence. I put it back in my jacket pocket, turned off the bench light, and locked the door behind me, walking out into an ordinary Thursday evening in a town that had no particular idea what had almost happened inside it, or what had finally, quietly, come to rest. The shop was empty by the time the last light left the windows, and on the bench beside a mantel clock waiting for its final polish, a small pocket watch sat, ticking steady and even, its crystal still carrying one thin crack from the 7 toward the center. Nobody was there to see it keep time. It kept time anyway, the way it always should have, cracked case and all, carrying its history forward instead of hiding it. I used to believe silence was the safest gift I could give the people I loved. I learned late, and at real cost, to almost everyone in this story that the truth was never actually the danger. What matters is who ends up holding it, and how carefully they choose to set it down. A secret kept out of fear protects no one for long, not really. It only delays the reckoning, and lets it grow heavier while it waits up, the way an unrepaired fault line only grows more dangerous the longer it sits quiet underground. A truth handed over gently at the right time, in the right hands, can still do what it was always meant to do. It can save people, even the ones who least expect to be saved by it, even the ones who never thought they deserved saving in the first place. They say God has a plan for every life, even when that plan looks for a long while like nothing but loss. I believe that now. I think God gives some of us $15 a week and 40 years of patience and asks us to build something quietly, one small, honest choice at a time, trusting we won't fully understand the shape of it until long after the work is done. I think God gives others a broken watch and a lifetime to decide what to do with it. And I think most of us, whatever we've been handed, are simply trying to figure out how to love the people in front of us without letting fear write the whole story on our behalf. If you were me standing in that room with proof enough to burn everything down, would you have done it? Or would you have chosen the way I finally did, to build something new out of the wreckage instead? I'd genuinely love to hear where you'd land and why. If this story stayed with you at all, tell me about someone in your own life who taught you that a flaw can be the strongest part of the grain. Share it with someone who needs reminding today that quiet strength is still strength. And if stories like this one matter to you, stay close. There are more of them coming, and I'd be glad to have you here for them.